Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ankara and the B20 conference. I'm Gamze Alaçam, the project coordinator of Infrastructure Investment Task Force. Today, I'm proud to present the panel on global FDI and capital allocation around the world. And I'm proud to introduce Mr. Arda Ermut, President of Investment Support and Promotion Agency of Turkey. Mr. Ermut will make the opening remarks and will frame the core objective of this session. Mr. Ermut, the floor is yours.
Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Investment Support and Promotion Agency of Turkey and as well as the World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies, WIPA, I have the great honor of welcoming you to Ankara and wishing you a very productive and successful session on impact of tax policies and international regulations on foreign direct investments and also on capital allocation around the world. In the midst of these economic challenges, timing for such meetings is very crucial, and the world economy, as you know, is undergoing a very profound transformation, creating opportunities and challenges at the same time in many areas, and including especially the foreign direct investments and international capital flows. Today, there are many factors affecting global FDI flows and capital allocation around the world. One of these factors is surely taxation, which can have both negative and positive impacts on foreign direct investments. For this reason, discussions on the impact of tax policies should be held delicately, as they may create obstacles to cross-border investments or lead investors to seek some tax havens, which would erode the fiscal benefits of such investments, especially for the host countries. Distinguished participants, as you may well guess, developing countries bear the negative impacts of tax avoidance. Today, it's estimated that multinational companies contribute annually around $730 billion to government budgets in developing countries. Again, it is that the estimated tax due to tax avoidance through offshore centers, developing countries' losses in tax revenues amount something like $100 billion in total per year. Considering the level of technical expertise and resources in developing countries, the negative impacts of complex tax avoidance on their economies could be dramatic. Such negative effects may endanger the economic development trajectory in these developing countries, in the long run especially, as well as the foreign capital inflows, especially foreign direct investments, have been a key instrument for sustainable economic development in these countries. While host countries should maximize the economic benefits of FDI, multinational companies should also be able to do business without weakening constraints. We mustn't let strict tax regulations and unfriendly investment climate preventing companies from investment. We must find the right balance between the interests of countries and companies at the same time, which are the main sources of FDI all around the world. It is, therefore, very critical to develop an intelligible tax policy that will both support productive investments and encourage multinational companies to invest more responsibly and more eagerly. The recent developments in the global economy, once again, have indicated that the need for a global governance system that will provide the international community with systematic coordination to tackle the economic challenges. By the very same token, we should increase cooperation on key issues such as tax avoidance and responsible investment. We should adopt a more inclusive and robust approach based on partnership and shared responsibility. In addition to including all stakeholders, we should also pay attention to implication of tax policies on facilitating and hindering investment flows. That is why it is crucial to have a balanced approach that takes all aspects of investments and taxation into consideration. Distinguished guests, we appreciate the considerable work and effort by the international organizations and platforms such as G20 and OECD to develop international standards, principles in this regard. Such events have been creating the ground for brainstorming and constructive discussions. As a result of these diligent efforts, significant progress has been achieved with OECD and G20, and we are grateful for their industry's works. I'm sure today your valuable discussions, and especially the constructive discussions that will be held in this session today with our competent participants, will make an important contribution to the development of international standards and principles on tax avoidance and other related issues. Your deliberations will take us a step further for creating a transparent tax policy and based on a clear set of consistent guidelines and regulations. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear guests, with that note, once again, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all our guests here, to our participants also, and a very fruitful session while enjoying your stay here in Turkey. Thanks very much.
Mr. Ermut, thank you for your speech. Now we can start to our panel. I'm happy to introduce Mr. William Morris. He is the chair of Taxation and Fiscal Policy Committee at BIAC and also director of General Electric. Mr. Morris has an extensive experience in the tax area. Mr. Morris will moderate the session. I would also like to introduce the panelists. Mr. Pascal Saint-Amans, head of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration at OECD. Mr. Aksay Mathur, director of Gateway House. Mr. Patrick Kulekani Dlamini is the chief executive and managing director at Development Bank of Southern Africa. And Mr. Nelson Salgado, vice president at Institutional Relations and Sustainability of Embraer. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I probably ought to just give you about 30 seconds to recognize that this is a panel where we'll talk at least a little bit about tax. So if you want to leave the room now, that's absolutely fine. We're never offended, us tax people are never offended when non-tax people leave the room. But I do promise you that if you stay, we won't talk about tax very much. Okay, so you're all staying, thank you. Mr. Ermut, thank you very much for that introduction. As I was saying to him earlier, I was in Turkey a couple of months ago for a WIPA conference, World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies, and there is a balance to be struck here. And Mr. Ermut made these points very clearly in his speech. There is a balance to be struck between preventing tax avoidance, preventing certain taxpayers from getting special deals, and at the same time ensuring that tax does not get in the way, and where possible helps with the flow of cross-border investment. And that, for me and for BIAC, is very much the theme of what we've been working on over the past couple of years. And as I think you'll hear from Pascal Saint-Amans of the OECD, this is also an OECD focus as well. So we'll be talking about that, but that was a great introduction. Thank you very much for that. And thank you also for introducing all of the speakers. I can turn this page over pretty quickly. The one thing that I do want to say, however, is that I sat in the last panel, which I actually found really quite inspirational. And I am deeply embarrassed to say that we are a totally male panel. So I apologize for that. In the world of tax, things are improving, but slowly. So we'll try and maybe at the next B20 conference ensure that there is at least a little gender diversity on the panel. So I just want to very briefly, maybe in a couple of minutes, set the table for this discussion. The B20 has been somewhat allergic to the concept and the word tax since its formation. There are possibly two reasons for this. The first is that taxes are either too boring or too complicated, or quite possibly both. It's about compliance, it's about revenue collection, it's about tens of thousands of pages of complex interactions in the tax code, boring or complicated. And the other theme, which is slightly different, is that those tax guys want to take over the world. And that therefore they try and insert themselves into every process that they can find in order to make sure that tax is the number one thing. Well, I'm here to tell you that both of those are wrong. Tax certainly is complicated, and if you think that complicated equals boring, then perhaps it's also boring. But actually its impact on the return of any cross-border project simply cannot be underestimated. And if you do a cross-border project without taking into account the tax implications of that, you are going to come unstuck. And tax is a very, very large cost. Now, that's not to say it's a cost which should be driven down to zero, and we can talk a little more about that, but it is a cost in any cross-border transaction. So while it might be complicated, certainly in a bottom line sense, it is not boring. And the second is, I promise you, we don't want to take over the world. It's more a reflection of that first point, that you cannot ignore tax in a transaction. So we just want to make sure that tax is actually taken into account, because it is a very important factor in private cross-border investment. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk a little more about as we go through this as well. So it's both a positive in that sense. Tax can be a positive. It can be a positive in terms of tax incentives, good tax incentives, proper tax incentives, things like capital allowances, R&D credits, but maybe also interest deductibility as well, and that'll be a little bit of the theme of this panel. It can also be a negative, again in a number of ways. It can be about protectionism. Tax can be used for national protectionism purposes. It can also be used to advantage home country businesses. We need to be very careful of that. We also need to be very, very careful of double taxation, which is a situation where one country taxes the whole of the pie, and then another country tries to tax the whole of the pie. They don't give a credit, and that means that instead of bearing a tax rate of, say, 15% or 30% or whatever the appropriate one is, you bear a tax rate of 60%. And again, that discourages cross-border investment. In that sense, tax can be a real negative. And then the final one that I want to point out is that also in this world of very complex interactions across borders, as you all, I suspect, know very well from the trade area, dispute resolution mechanisms are very important. And at the moment, in the tax area, those still need working on. Again, as Pascal will probably talk about, they are being worked on. But the lack of dispute resolution can be a very serious impediment to cross-border investment. So that's why I think tax is important and why we want to talk about it in the context of this panel and in the context of cross-border infrastructure. Now, what I want to do now is just to read very briefly the recommendation on this. As I say, this is the first time that there's been a B20 recommendation on tax. It's recommendation 5, which is about developing a common set of international investment principles and promoting greater transparency and harmony in taxation related to FDI. And then just to read out the third leg of that, promote greater transparency and harmony in taxation incentives related to FDI and give due attention in the discussions on the base erosion and profit shifting, BEPS, to the impact of rules on debt and interest deductibility on cross-border infrastructure investment. This puts tax onto the B20 agenda. Now, why is it important that we look at tax? I've talked about this in general terms, but what this recommendation is saying is a number of things, and it's not saying some other things. So firstly, it's saying there should be clarity and transparency around incentives and tax systems. That's to say they should be open, there should not be sweetheart deals, there should not be deals done behind the curtain or under the table. These deals should be available to everybody. And particularly in the context of some countries, I think it may have been Christine Lagarde, it may have been somebody else this morning who talked in a lovely word, I thought. She talked about the evaporation of things. We need to be careful that there isn't evaporation in certain countries, and clarity and transparency about the tax system is very important in that. The other thing that we need to be very clear about, and this also goes to what this recommendation is talking about, is this is not just about tax policy. It's not just about setting out the right rules. It's also looking at the administration of those rules and checking that the tax authorities are administering them in a fair way, in an open way, in one which respects, again, a word used this morning, the rule of law. So I think this is actually a really important B20 recommendation, and one that I hope that we can very much focus on and follow up on with the G20, but also follow up in subsequent B20 meetings to see how this has been done. So just to very briefly tell you what you already know, but as I'm setting the table, I'll set this little part out as well. Why is this important? Well, we heard again this morning, we've heard both in the B20 session that we had on this, but also in the finance minister's central bankers session. The world is desperately short of infrastructure investment. There is a $1 to $2 trillion gap, $1 trillion gap each year. In relation to less developed countries, that gap is 1 trillion. These are things which could make a huge difference to people's lives. These are things which will increase economies dramatically, which will give people jobs, which will give them security, which will strengthen states, all of those things, so long as they're done in the right way. Infrastructure is incredibly important. Another thing we need to bear in mind is that, as we know, many governments are already tapped out when it comes to funding. So a large amount of this funding is not going to come from governments. It needs to come from the private sector. And that's why, again, why tax becomes important in this. Where's it going to come from? Well, again, as has been discussed, a lot of this needs to come from currently untapped sources. So sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. Currently, those two together only have less than 1%. 0.8% apparently of their assets in cross-border infrastructure. That is an asset class which dramatically needs to grow. But both of these institutions, both of these parties, both of these sectors bring special tax needs to the table which we need to take into account. Firstly, they have very little external debt. So if we're looking at tax rules which measure interest deductibility based on external debt, there's a problem there. Also, some of these projects are absolutely enormous, I mean staggeringly large, and can only be done by consortia. That means that there may be large numbers of relatively small investors. 10% for tax purposes can be a small number in terms of investors. Again, we need to look at rules which give benefits only to majority investors. We need to think very carefully about this. So again, we need to think very carefully about a number of these things. Debt is often used to fund infrastructure investments, not necessarily for tax purposes, although, yes, there is a tax side to that, but in part because it's easy to get your money out if it's put in the form of debt, and also the return that you get on debt over very long-term projects is much easier to be certain about, is much easier to on-sell if you need to do that, than something which is reliant on a dividend flow. Where dividends may be hard to get out of a country, may be a little lumpy sometimes. So there are many reasons for using debt. Now, what I'm not saying here is that every tax advantage has to be given to absolutely everything. And that's not what the BEPS project was about. But what it is when we look at these projects, and when we look at the tax rules, let's make sure that the two of them mesh rather than clash. So to head into the speakers, I'm going to ask Pascal to speak first, because we'll move from tax, away from tax, although Pascal has promised me that he won't be uber technical in this discussion. But Pascal has been heading up the OECD project on base erosion and profit shifting, exercising a mandate from the G20 in what has quite frankly been one of the major 2 or 3 G20 projects since its foundation, and yet which has not featured so far in the B20 discussions. I will be very clear, and BIAC has been very clear about this from the beginning. There have been problems in the international tax rules caused by globalization moving much faster than developments in the international tax rules, which means that the tax rules have to catch up. And that is totally valid. It's valid in a technical sense, it's also valid in a political sense. Because following the financial crisis and a drop-off in revenues, there has been understandable and justifiable public concern about everybody paying the taxes that they owe. And what the OECD project has tried to do is to increase the international framework around that, to come up with consensus-based rules and to draw in a much broader range of countries than just the traditional OECD countries. The G20, to be sure, including our hosts here in Turkey, but even a wider range than that. And while the OECD has been criticized for not paying appropriate attention to the developing countries, I have to tell you, that's simply a mistake. The OECD has been paying attention to developing countries, and this is a project which can be made to work for everybody. So I think that's probably enough on the table setting. Just to be very clear, what I do hope we can do in this panel, and what I hope we can do in the B20 as well, is not to bring the focus in on tax so much as to actually bring tax into a broader economic focus, and to say that this is one of the features that we need to consider when we're looking at the broader economy, when we're looking at increasing cross-border trade and investment, when we're trying to grow jobs, trying to increase growth. Tax is a part of that. It's not something separate over here dealt with by tax nerds. It's actually a larger part of the general economy. So this is about bringing tax into this arena and making sure that the new tax rules mesh with what we need for trade and investment and for growth. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Pascal. We'll then go around the other panelists and ask them for their general impressions, and then we'll do 2 more rounds asking people what they view as significant procedural process things that stand in the way of cross-border trade investment, whether they're tax or other things, and then the flip side of that, what can be done to improve that? And then I hope we'll have some time for questions from the audience. So with that, Pascal.
Thank you, Will. Good afternoon to you all. I think indeed that this panel is probably exactly what you don't want to do. I mean, you come for investment and you end up with taxes. And that's exactly what we want to avoid, I think, in terms of both tax administrations and investors. And we'll try to develop on that theme. First, tax is not necessarily a good thing for growth. I mean, it's a burden, it's an obstacle to investment and so, but the governments who need to fund the infrastructure, the social security system, and all the other public expenditures, which may be too high, but even when they are properly fine-tuned, they need the taxes, and therefore the investors know that they will have to pay some taxes. We've done some work in the past on tax and growth, trying to highlight what are the tax policies which are the less unfavorable to growth, and I think that's the issue. As regards international tax, it's, as Will emphasized it, it's extremely important that investors, cross-border investors, do not face double taxation or multiple taxation. All the countries on tax are sovereign, and tax is at the core of sovereignties. So tax policies are national, and very often they ignore what the other countries are doing. And especially as these tax policies based on direct taxation have been built at a time where globalization was not at the point where it is now. And as a result, you face a real risk of double taxation, because the principle is that a country will tax its residents on a worldwide basis while it will tax the non-resident on the source basis. Meaning that if you're a cross-border investment, you'll be taxed at source, and you'll also be taxed at residence. It's slightly more complex than that, but basically you face the risk of double taxation. What we've done, we being the international community, starting with the League of Nations back in the 1920s, and since the 1950s at the OECD and also at the UN, is to develop models to eliminate double taxation, so that cross-border investments would not suffer double taxation, which would be a big impediment to the growth of cross-border investments. And we've developed models of tax treaties, but also of transfer pricing rules. Transfer pricing being about the internal pricing of transaction within a group of companies, even though the owner of the company doesn't really care whether the profit is here or there, depending on the level of taxation, but assuming that the level of taxation would be the same, the CEO or the CFO do not really care. Why the countries care? They really care about taxing the value created on their territory. So that's why we have these transfer pricing rules, which initially were a burden on companies, obliging them to price the transactions at a market price where they didn't need to do it for internal reasons. this turning into a big opportunity for companies to locate the profit in the low tax jurisdiction. So you see that something which was a burden initially could be turned into an opportunity. And things were at this point where we were pretty good at eliminating double taxation with more than 3,000 bilateral treaties, transfer pricing rule being updated and being largely approved. And then the crisis hits, and we face some political concern, and I would say some popular concern, about being too good at eliminating double taxation to the point where there might be double non-taxation, meaning the ability of investors to locate their profits in no-tax jurisdiction where no activity is taking place. And as a result, the taxing countries, or the countries where the real activities take place, facing a drop in the revenue they collect. Even though the statistics do not show exactly this, there is still some evidence, and we'll come to that publicly when we deliver the BEPS package to the G20 finance minister on the 8th of October, in 1 month's time. There is evidence that there has been a problem of tax collection because of this phenomenon that we've called base erosion and profit shifting. In other words, globalization is a reality for investors, while for governments, it's pure local approach. And these bilateral rules to eliminate double taxation in a purely globalized environment where the value chain now focuses much more on intangible property, which is very easy to delocate, has resulted in a gap between these sovereignties, these gaps being used by investors to reduce their tax burden, and so be it. These are the interstices between sovereignties that one could call tax havens. But as a result, you have a popular and then a political move to say, we cannot sustainably face this type of situation. Because if we do so, corporate income tax may disappear at some point in time. And this was extremely sensitive during the crisis because VAT, or personal income taxes, have increased everywhere, in all the countries. VAT has increased in 27 out of 33 OECD countries having VAT. We have 34 members. The US doesn't have a VAT system, but VAT has increased everywhere. So at the same time where you have mainstream media explaining that large, profitable companies have an effective tax rate of 2 to 5% on their offshore income, you have the people in the street, the man and the woman in the street, facing an increase of taxation. Right or wrong, you have this perception that there is something to be fixed in the international tax system. And that's why the G20 mandated the OECD to reflect on that and to produce a plan to fix the issue. That's the BEPS plan that we have been working on for the past 2 years. But actually, beyond this very political, some would say populist approach, you have some fundamentals which I think we need to collectively understand if you want to move ahead in a positive manner for investment. The first one is you cannot afford an international tax system which facilitates the delocation of the profits in no tax jurisdiction where nothing is happening. There is a very simple principle, I would call it common sense, which is the right to tax should accrue in the countries where the value is added. Even though it's difficult to define where the value is added, but still, where the activities generate the value. It's very hard to explain to politicians or to people tax lawyers are very good at explaining that because of this or that, it's perfectly fine to have $2 trillion of accumulated profit of US companies in Bermuda. Hard to understand. Second, there is a need for international tax rules to be global for investors. You're global, and you want one set of rules. You don't want double standards. You don't want to have a number of countries saying, well, this is the way we'll eliminate double taxation, and another group of countries saying, well, we'll do it otherwise, because then you face double taxation. And that's the core of the problem. And what we've done in this project is that we've been able to bring all the G20 countries on an equal footing with all the OECD countries. We have 44 countries on an equal footing in this project. Equal footing means that they contribute to consensus. They agree or don't, but when they agree, they are committed to the same set of rules, which increase certainty, at least in terms of geographical scope. And of course, there is the need to adapt these to developing countries, which have also been involved in that project. The third element, which I think is extremely important, and this requires to look at this with some perspective, is to avoid unilateral measures, to avoid protectionism. And tax can be a very nasty protectionist tool in the hands of government. And when you have a public outcry, public concern, political approach to this issue of double non-taxation, it's very easy for governments to move away from an international consensus which is hard to understand. When you have transfer pricing rules allowing all the intangible property to be located in a jurisdiction where you just have a trust and nothing else, it's very hard to explain that it's legitimate. So governments could have moved to unilateral measures. Some have, and some OECD high-profile countries. The UK, for instance, have taken the diverted profit tax, which is some form of unilateral measures. But most of the governments, because of the BEPS projects, have held on. They've said, no, we're not going to take unilateral, uncoordinated measures because we want to coordinate. So if you put that in perspective, I think the world would not be how it is today without this project, even though I hear the business community often complaining about the increase of uncertainty and risk, but think of what it would be without that. Finally, we need to be better at the elimination of double taxation. It was hard to sell to governments and tax administration when you had massive double non-taxation. Now that we're fixing it, we need to be much better at eliminating double taxation. Where there are tax disputes between governments, the current standards provide for the competent authorities will endeavor to eliminate double taxation, meaning that they are not obliged to anything. And we want to change that. Ideally, we should move to arbitration. Governments are still a bit reluctant, so we'll try to move to a minimum standard on the way to handle mutual agreement procedures so that there is a real impact on tax administration. We put an end to double non-taxation. We want to fix double taxation in a sustainable manner. Now, what are the next steps and what's the link with investment? First, the first link is obvious. We want a system which is sustainable, in which member countries will believe, because that would allow them to have one set of standards which will be sustainable. We eliminate double taxation, we don't facilitate double non-taxation. So we create again this sense of consensus and of convergence between the countries, which, if it's broadly accepted, and OECD and G20 represent 90% of the world economy, I think that provides some level of certainty. The second layer is about the implementation. We'll come up with 15 measures, and as you're lucky enough not to be tax specialist, I saved you the details of the measures, but we'll improve transparency through country-by-country reporting, for instance. We'll fix the international tax rules, transfer pricing, tax treaties. We'll also bridge the gaps between the sovereignties so that there is no more interstices, and when a country decides on its tax policy, it will think of the spillovers on the others, so that we put an end to hybrid mismatches, for instance, where, I mean, the tax administration lose, and as a result, it's only about those able to use the tricks which have a tax competitive advantage, which unlevel the playing field among players. So that's not fair for the business. We need to level the playing field. So with this set of rules, I think the main challenge for the years to come is about the implementation. We do not want rogue tax administrations to abuse of some instruments to do adjustments. We don't want rogue taxpayers to use the loopholes just to save taxes in an aggressive manner. So implementation will be key to make sure that we don't open double non-taxation opportunities, but that tax administrations are fair and that they play by the rule of law. So implementation will be something key. And within implementation, I include the issue of inclusiveness. We need to be inclusive for developing countries to benefit from this, and also to benefit from the opportunity of offering open tax system which will be connected with the rest of the world so that they are not in isolation there. Implementation will be key, inclusiveness, and that's why we are proposing to the G20, and we hope to get a mandate by Saturday to develop something like a global forum which would be extremely inclusive and which would look at the implementation issues. Finally, and if we look forward, once we fix these quite legalistic approaches of eliminating double taxation, I think we should focus on how the tax issues can be inputted in the reflection and the discussion on trade, on investment. What do we need? I mean, we need employment, we need jobs, we need growth, we need investment. How can we make sure that tax is not a hurdle to these investments, beyond the elimination of double taxation? And we think that there is definitely a horizontal reflection to start on that with our trade friends, our investment friends, so that we have maybe a more business-friendly approach on the tax matters in this area. And we very much look forward to be able to work into that direction with generic or general ideas and thinking, but also concrete deliverables. How can we make sure that investments through investment funds can get streamlined benefit of tax treaties, which is not the case today. We have very sophisticated rules, but they are not implemented properly because tax administrations don't talk enough to each other, and that may have, or that may be, a serious leverage to increase investment in the future. So I think the future is pretty bright, even though the past might have been gloomy, and the present is about finalizing this BEPS project that we hope the finance ministers and then the leaders of the G20 will welcome in October and then in November. Thank you.
End of any detailed tax discussion, so now you really can stay. But we're going to get three reflections now from a business, from a bank, and from a think tank, and from three of the key growth regions around the world. So I'm simply going to go this way. So I'm going to ask Nelson if he would like to first talk about his experiences at Embraer and perhaps in Brazil.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to start thanking the B20 for the invitation to be here. It's a big honor to be sitting here with such distinguished panelists. And first, I have to say that I'm neither a tax specialist nor an infrastructure specialist. But I've been working for almost 30 years in a company that has itself made a lot of cross-border investment. And the reason for that investment was mainly expanding our supply chain abroad, which brings some different issues which I'd like to share with you here. Embraer, as an aircraft manufacturer, we always had a global market. So our customer base has always been global, and our supply chain has always been global as well, as far as things that we are acquiring from suppliers. But the stuff that we were doing ourselves, the parts that we were doing ourselves, was very much concentrated in Brazil, the country where we are incorporated. So 15 years ago, we started a movement to turn ourselves from Brazilian exporters to really global companies. And FDI, investing to have an industrial footprint in countries where we had important markets, was a very important part of that process. Having said that, it becomes clear that a tax break was not the reason for doing that. The reason is really to have a bigger presence in the markets that are important for you. In our case, obviously, when I say this, when you get to go to a final decision in which country, for example, in Europe, you want to place your industrial activity, which was our case, it's very important to look at tax and also WTO compliant incentives. That can be very important. But it will not make a big difference within Europe, for example. In our case, we've chosen Portugal for cultural fit reasons. So tax, in the end of the day, become the third driver for that. I'd like to point out that I don't think the Embraer case is isolated. I think many foreign direct investment was driven to expand global supply chains. And one interesting aspect of that is somehow you are expanding investments in areas where you have trade. Then you look at the regulations for those two things. Regulations for trade, they have a long track record of helping in a multi-country environment. The WTO has had a very important role on trade negotiations. We have to recognize the importance of preferential agreements, but when you talk about trade, multilateral agreements have a very important role. When you look at investment, on the other hand, there's no multilateral agreement. You have, as Pascal mentioned, today around 3,000 bilateral agreements around investments. That adds a terrible lot of complexity. And this situation is not good for anybody. We can see that the number of bilateral agreements that have been signed recently has decreased a lot. Countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, they have issued their own investment models because they are not happy with the investment or models that originated from Europe or the US, which they think they have clauses that are unacceptable. So the division is becoming higher and higher. So both at the regulatory environment and at the tax environment, we have a very bad situation in terms of complexity. How do we move away from that? I think regarding tax, I very much like the idea of the BEPS effort that has been conducted by the OECD. I think that can really set the basis for us to have in a more uniform tax base that can really incentivize investments. For you to have an idea, in Brazil, we have to top up 34% profit tax. Doesn't matter what is the tax on the place where you're investing. I say that, well, when it gets so bad, there's no problem how the tax base is on the destination because you always have to top up 34%. So a double taxation is really a big problem. And after the session, I'll ask Pascal, where is this paradise of double non-taxation he's talking about? I've not known. And I believe when you talk about tax, it's very important that the BEPS effort move forward and all the developing countries are brought into this as well. But when we talk about the regulatory domain, it's not very easy to find a solution that is ongoing. But I keep asking myself if after so many years of bilateral agreements, if it is not the time for us to try to go back to a multilateral negotiation. I know there is a lot of, it's fair to say that there is, things worked very slow at the WTO for a long time, but we have signs recently with the trade facilitation agreement, for example, that was recently approved. And for you to have an idea how much important is that, that was the #1 priority defined by the trade task force of this B20 Turkey presidency. So the trade facilitation agreement is a very important one. So I keep asking myself if it is not the time for us to go back to the WTO, learn with all the bilateral agreements that we have here and what the points that are not acceptable to everybody, and see if that can be a way for us to have a better regulatory environment for investment as well. And as Pascal said, in this kind of investment, trade regulations and investment regulations, they go side by side. There's no reason they should be as separated as they are today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelson. That was much of that will have been music to Pascal's ears, as it should have been. And indeed, one of the aspects of the BEPS project is an idea of a multilateral agreement to deal with at least some of the outstanding issues to try and gain that consistency that Pascal was talking about. So now we're going to turn to Patrick, who in addition to his current banking role, has also previously worked with with South African Airways, so has experience in the business sector as well as in the banking sector. So perhaps you could give us your perspective on this, Patrick.
Thank you very much, William, and a very good afternoon to the lovely audience. I hope you have had the opportunity to appreciate the hospitality of Turkey like I have been able to do. And actually, credit goes to the organizers of this conference. That I think we all actually agree that it went fantastically well. So far, really, it's been quite a standard for the next presidents of the G20. But coming back to the subject at hand, the issue of tax and its impact on FDI is a very critical one. Critical in the sense that we all appreciate that tax are a very critical instrument within the fiscal authority of the government. And tax revenues are a major source of service delivery in terms of the government trying to meet the basic needs of the various countries. And when you have these tax loopholes, or when we have tendencies of tax evasion, because I mean there's a very clear difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance. And tax evasion is very much illegal and quite punishable by a rule of law in many countries. Certainly in South Africa it is the case. And tax avoidance is when you as a taxpayer or a corporate is trying to minimize its tax liability within the legal framework of or regulation, regulating actually the taxable income and corporate tax within the country. But the continent of Africa, first, maybe start off by trying to make you understand how we operate as the Development Bank of Southern Africa. We have a geographic mandate that covers the entire continent of Africa in terms of funding the infrastructure projects in the areas of energy, areas of transport, areas of ICT, and areas of water infrastructure. And we work with quite a lot of multilateral development banks as well as national DFIs across the globe. But we have seen that of the 49 least developed countries, 39 are in the continent of Africa. That actually, you can even begin to imagine the impact of their poor tax systems or lack of advanced tax administration system, and how much that actually can lend itself into a serious tax evasion, because when you do not have an advanced tax regulation in place and compliance and enforcement of that in the country, you then have a very, very limited resources that any central fiscus can be able actually to borrow or even to collect, which also goes very far in terms of what we expect as DFIs, because as DFIs we expect to work with these central fiscus, because sovereigns are supposed to be standing behind their strategic projects, and they're supposed to be promoting their country's special economic zones. So we want to see them having much more stronger central fiscus so that they can be able actually to offer, where practically possible, sovereign guarantees to make sure that the projects are well underpinned. But when you have central fiscus that are weak, which is the case on the continent, and many of the central fiscus are even dependent on donor countries because they have insufficient tax collections and very weak balance sheet themselves, it creates a serious problem for FDIs coming into the country, because you are expecting that your destination of your investment is a destination that has got a very transparent tax system, very fair tax system. Yes, we have quite a lot of countries with what we term double taxation agreement, which says how do we as two countries where you are an origin of an FDI and a recipient of the FDI are able actually to avoid double taxation, as Pascal actually said earlier on. That actually goes a long way in trying to protect the investor so that they can be able actually to see the net benefit of their FDI. So in the case of the African continent, the taxation and the FDIs, we have seen actually a tremendous growth in FDI. Like for instance, in 2014, we saw almost a 90 billion US dollar FDI into the continent, which was predominantly, yes, destined for extractive industries. We all know what has happened to commodities globally. We all know actually what has happened also to hydrocarbon producing countries, and the impact that that has on the foreign debt of those countries, and the impact that that has onto the corporate and the indebtedness of those corporates, which creates its own crisis. So therefore, it becomes quite an important subject that within the G20, we really work very hard. And the issue of the transfer pricing, it has created very interesting challenges. We have seen it in our funding exercises where you saw, for instance, company A coming from country A investing in company B, and the EPC is a subsidiary of company A, and company A has got to have a partner in country B that they work together, a local company, so that they can be able actually to try and meet the local requirements and the skill transfers and the local content regulations. But then you saw company A and its EPC, which is a subsidiary, overloading cost in their investment destination countries, which meant that their partner company will then begin not to see the right and rightful benefits accruing to them because of that relationship, and also because of the impact of transfer pricing, which ended having its own unintended consequences. But in many cases where you never had that association with the EPC contractor, it tended to work much more better. But I must say that we haven't had much complaints in the form of too much taxation by many foreign direct investment into the continent. We have seen a remarkable improvement in the regulation, given the commitment that also we've seen coming from various governments across the continent, and also under the auspices of the African Union, saying we need to see more investment so that we can be able to see so many emerging markets on the continent beginning to get their fair share of the economic growth and being able actually to create an inclusive economies. But we are very far from where we're supposed to be. But the global financial turmoil, which we've seen in the last few weeks, has not helped what actually we would love to see. But an interesting picture as well emerging, where you're seeing America as a superpower of the world, beginning actually to see tangible benefits because of its QEs, and where you start seeing them growing at 3% plus, where you then started to see an exodus of capital for America, given the stability in its institution, given the predictability that you get in that, and the advancement of the system, which then also causes certain challenges. But again, it is also an opportunity to say emerging market countries also need to start fine-tuning their incentive programs and fine-tuning their skill sets, and to say if they were to play their role in the global supply chain, they need to be competitive, because the FDI has got options. If you do not have the right incentive and regulatory environment, FDI is going to find its next home somewhere else, which says we are going to have economic consequences for not doing the right thing so as to become attractive to the FDI that actually you so much require. Thank you very much. Program.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Some really very good, clear insights in that, particularly this point about the importance of functioning tax authorities to the health of the state itself, and the importance of that in being an attractive home for foreign direct investment. Some very important things there, but also some very valid points. about transfer pricing and about some of the problems in the international tax system, and trying to balance those two things out. So now we're going to move to Akshay. I should tell you that in addition to working for his current job, which is at a think tank, previously he worked at Fidelity in the US, so he also has experience working for a large fund and did a fair amount of work there, in addition to getting degrees in the US. So again, covering a range here. He's going to talk more about some of the geopolitical aspects of this, but I hope also we'll just touch on, maybe if he feels up to it, a comparison between the last Indian administration and this one, and in particular how the current administration has tried to reach out in terms of improving some of the certainty again for foreign direct investors in a number of well-known cases, which I'm not going to mention, but also most recently this week in relation to the minimum alternative tax and the understanding about certainty as to the past as well as to the future when it comes to making FDI decisions. So, Akshay.